So it's great to be back on air talking all things development. And today I have James Dawson with me, which is super exciting. He's a master in the commercial property space, has been for just a couple of years now. And we're going to talk all things interest rates from a borrowing perspective, investor perspective, and definitely rates of return. So welcome, James. Glad to have you on air.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Great to see you, and great to be back online a little bit.
Yeah, it's certainly be a little bit of time of being online. So I'd much rather be doing this over a glass of wine with you anyway. um, let's get into it. So it's an interesting topic at the moment because I think over the last few years, we've seen interest rates go down further than what I've ever seen them in my lifetime. What's your
Yeah,
take on that?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I can remember when I think I first met you, which maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, and the rates were at 5 and 4, and we were talking about locking things in, and
Yeah.
everyone said, could they go any lower than 4? And we were all saying, oh no, it would never happen. And now, of course, we're in the ones and twos, and I must admit, I remember saying, I think to the group that I had then was that friends of mine in Europe, that had property and loans in, say, Sweden, and they were at, 0.75%, and we were all just laughing about that. So
Yeah.
it was just interesting how your perception changes and what you're used to. So now we're all used to these low rates.
And some people would have never have seen interest rates that have been in the double digits before.
Yeah. Oh, God, well, so I meant to, when I bought my first property I think in about 1980 or something like that, I was paying Newcastle Perm 18% interest, and that was just the norm. And then it was sort of all over the place. That over the years it went 14, 12, 9, 7, back up. 21% was the highest rate I'd ever paid with Macquarie Bank when I was in a development in the early 90s, I think that was.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember going back to those days. I was in business then. We were just mentioning earlier that we managed it though. With interest
Yeah,
rates like that in the 20s, you did what you had to do and you managed it.
yeah.
Interesting now when we start looking at the interest rates we're paying, what that looks like, and definitely what investors are expecting to get if they are lending money into a project, what they're expecting to get as a return. Do you deal in a lot of that space?
Look, I do have, I guess I touch on it a bit because, I have done some developments, not doing any developments at the moment, mostly refurbs. But I know that, people in the past were expecting sometimes to get, say, 15%, return if
Yeah.
they're putting money into a project. And certainly when I was lending some money, as a mezzanine lender, I was getting 15%. But now, talking to some mates that are in that space at the moment, they're hoping to get maybe even as low as 6.5 to 8% on money that they're lending into projects. So it's just following the rates down, basically, hasn't it?
Well, look, it has. I want to give people a little bit of context here. So James, you are all about lifestyle. This is
Yeah,
what property
absolutely.
does for you. Actually gives you the lifestyle that you want. And I think for so many people going into property, irrelevant to what they're doing, um, there is that around it. They're trying to achieve a lifestyle for themselves. Irrelevant to what
Yeah.
that is, but they're trying to achieve a lifestyle. You've actually mastered that,
Uh,
and an author as well. So of a book that explains it exceptionally well. You have your own program that really steps people through the commercial side of things. So returns on investment and interest rates are a fairly big deal in the space that you play in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I've always really been about positive cash flow. So the
Yeah.
last 40 years, even when I had that property, that first block of flats I bought in Newcastle East at, with an 18% loan, I can remember that was just slightly positive when I finally sort of got them fixed up and rented out.
Yep.
So right through, I've never been, a fan of negative gearing. There's nothing wrong with it if you're in a particular circumstance that you want to make, take advantage of the tax rules and use that, of course, but you know, to my mind, property investing and development's a business. So you want to get paid for your effort and your risk, and it's never without its dramas, and it's never without its stresses when you're buying, etc., or renovating or doing whatever you're doing, dealing with partners. So you need to get paid for that. So I'm really about getting properties and recommending to people that buy any particularly commercial property that it is cash flow positive from the day of settlement. So that's what I'm all about, and it's at the moment, you can get 6 or 7 or 8% returns on commercial. You're borrowing at say 3 roughly. It's pretty easy to figure out that they're cash flow positive.
Yeah, it's not hard to work out, is it? So I remember when we first met, and this is a program that you ran. So yeah, a lot of the things that you spoke about, but definitely from a positive perspective, it being, positive income into your bank account, because why wouldn't you? And the opportunity is out there to create great end results for tenants, and definitely if you're using investors to fund things, certainly for them as well. So if we look at the investor side of things and their expectations, are you seeing a mismatch at all with people's expectations versus what's actually achievable these days? Because the situation has changed so much over, I say, a short period of time, because in the whole scheme of things, I think, the last 3 or 4 years has been a short period of time. But are you seeing any mismatches in expectation versus what's achievable nowadays?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I sort of made a rod from my own back in a way, because, when I first started, we'd be looking at properties that were returning, say, 8 to up to 12% net on average. And then the interest rates were around, say, 5%, so they were cash flow positive. But now, of course, it's dropped back. But I still find that people they're stuck on getting an 8 or 9% return, and it's just extremely difficult. Or they're buying a risky property. So to get that higher return, obviously sometimes higher returns, higher risk.
Mm-hmm.
So I do, when I'm speaking to people now, there's a lot of chat about, hey, look, it's going to be hard to find an 8% net return. You're really going to be looking at 6.5% net. But it still gives you the same level of cash flow positivity, because you're only paying maybe, I just recently got a loan from Macquarie, I think at 2.6%. And some loans through ANZ for commercial under 1.2 million or 2.4%, maybe even less, depending who you are, depending on the deal. So, people have to be sort of re-educated a little bit. And I think the biggest thing is that people sort of stop doing the numbers, so they just have a return locked in their mind, but they haven't done the numbers on a deal. So they really, anyone listening to this, just redo the numbers on a 6% return and a 2.5% loan, and see where it's at.
I think too, and you're dead right. It's I see the same. It's a fixation that this is what it needs to be worth doing.
Yeah.
I definitely agree that yes, with that bit more risk that people take, you're going to get that higher return. But one thing I know, speaking to you over the years, James, is when you get into a property, it doesn't necessarily stop there. There are uplifts that you can create, a higher return, but you've actually got to put a bit of effort into doing that and continually take action. How are you seeing that unfold now? Are you still seeing the ability to create those sort of uplifts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, just even rebranding and repositioning may be a bit of a slow burn, I guess. But, one of the most basic uplifts is buying something that, perhaps is a little bit under market rent. So and I wouldn't say, funnily enough, I'm just doing some numbers this morning on a deal where the rent is actually about 50% below market.
Wow.
So, in that situation, it's very difficult to probably get that rent up to market in one go. I mean, you don't really want to kill the tenant's business, or, so let's say you find a property that's, 10 or 15% under market. It's a pretty safe bet that you could bring that rent up to market within, say, 12 months, 2 years. And therefore, because your value is based on your rental income, you're going to get an uplift in value basically without, picking up a paintbrush or a hammer or doing anything. But I do I've just bought another little shopping centre up in Forest Lakes, in just south of Brisbane, a bit out of Brisbane City. And built in 2006, but it needs a bit of a tart up. It needs some lipstick, it needs some painting, some gardening, and all that. It's a great building, but it just needs a bit of love. Now, that won't lead to an immediate uplift, but I would imagine that when the rent reviews come up over the next, it's got 10 tenancies there, so when the rent reviews come up over the next couple of years, the centre should be looking better, the tenants will feel better, the businesses will hopefully be better. I'm also going to do a bit of, Facebook marketing, social media marketing for them. So, you get a little bit more of an uplift in that just because you've given the place a bit of love.
It's interesting, the expectation to go in straight away, into an end result and preference to, like you've just explained, actually having to work through it over a couple of years and being okay that you've got a great solid asset. It just takes time to get things back to that position that that you'd ideally like to see. And I mean, we can look at a multitude of ways that people end up with leases that are under market rent. How do you see self-management as an effect on that?
Oh, look, I think a lot of deals that we look at or get, run past at this are self-managed, and I just think, it for a landlord, I just think, absolutely shooting yourself in the foot pretty much to self-manage, unless you're absolutely onto it. And even me, with my experience, I just can't be bothered. I'd much rather pay an agent 5%, which actually in some leases, funnily enough, the tenants actually have to pay the cost of picking up their own rent, which perhaps sounds a little bit unfair, but that's the reality. But, for my mind, I'm better off paying an agent. It's tax deductible. And, you've only got to miss one rental increase or miss one thing. Because, for example, tenants get a window of opportunity to re-sign their lease. It's usually, between 6 and 3 months before their end of their lease. Now, if they're a great tenant, quite often they forget to do that. So if you've got a good property manager, they'll remind the tenant, do you want to take up your option? Now, that could affect your financing, and all sorts of things if they forget to take up the option, for example. And this particular property I'm doing the numbers on this morning, 50% under market. It's managed, self-managed by a very elderly guy. He's obviously got friendly with the tenant, and now, he's trying to sell it, and it's just extremely difficult for him to sell it at a figure that's going to make sense to him. He just thinks it's worth, $600,000 or $700,000 in any case, but in actual fact, it's probably only worth $400,000 or $350,000. So it just can be a major disaster waiting to happen.
It's a good point that you bring up. So I totally agree on the self-managed side of things. First, why would you? You've got better things to be doing, like let's go and find your next property.
That's right.
To trying to manage something. There are some great commercial agents out there that do a phenomenal job. And those little things that you can forget to do have the biggest impact on the value of your property. So getting back to that, you had mentioned it can affect your finance. Absolutely, it can. If you don't take up an option or you don't take advantage of that opportunity and it just slides past, or a rent review or an increase, the annual increases that the rents have, how does it affect not just their income, because it's going to affect your income, there's no two ways about it, but how do you see that? How does that affect your value?
Oh, look, it can have a massive effect because, essentially when you're looking at a property, if a valuer is doing a valuation for you, if the leases are all expired, for example, or you've got maybe 5 tenants and 3 of the leases haven't been taken up and they're on month to month, so that basically that tenant could just leave at any moment and you've got really no recourse. Whereas if they've signed their option up for another 3 years, it's pretty safe to say they're going to be there for 3 years and you've got some security. So a valuer is going to, either drop the value on that property or make a comment about it at least, which when the bank's looking at that, even they'll look at the comment and they'll go, wow, this has got what's called a low WALE, which is the weighted average lease expiry date. It's a bit of a formula, but it's basically how short the leases are averaged over the property. And, it can have a big effect. Whereas if you, let's say, buying a Bunnings building, with Bunnings as a tenant and they're on a 30-year lease with options, the valuer will look at that and say, wow, this is great, very easy to value this property. Also, as you mentioned, if they're not collecting the outgoings properly, for example, well, not only are you missing out on the cash flow, but when you go to get that property valued, the income that they're valuing the property on is just not correct. It's lower, so the property is going to be a lower number on the end page of that valuation.
So going into the market and looking at these, if we're looking at returns, so you find a nice little group of shops that could have 3 or 4 tenancies in it, so 3 or 4 independent leases, and they've gone to market with what they think is a market value based on what the leases should be, right? Nice long leases and all the rest of it. We will often see things that they've listed a price with net rent.
Yeah. Yeah.
How often do you see that net rent as being the real net rent?
Oh, it's an absolute classic, and it's a great negotiation tactic actually. To, what happens is they present you an information memorandum with all the numbers on it, and they might say this property's worth $6 million, and at $6 million, it's a 7% net return, for example. Mm-hmm. But when you dissect the numbers and get deep down into the numbers, you might find that actually, it's not really 7%. It's only showing, 6% or something like that on the $6 million, because some of their numbers are a little bit out. Or, classic I saw recently was quoting the council rates as, $2,600 per annum, but it was actually $2,600 per quarter. Oh. So, and they're simple mistakes. I mean, often they're not made deliberately. No. Sometimes they are. But I had one friend of mine was buying a property, and the rental income was miscalculated, and the landlord actually put his hand up and said, look, I'm sorry, I've told you the wrong numbers, but how about I give you $20,000 off the price? And my friend said, oh, that sounds great. It was a $3 million property. I'll take that. And I said, no, hang on a minute. It actually worked out that on the cap rate that they'd negotiated on, it worked out that the difference in value was about $120,000, not $20,000. So they end up negotiating $100,000 off the price. And the thing was, Melissa, when it's easy to point it out to them and say, well, look, you've told us this number, but actually it's this number. So we're working our numbers on a cap rate. It's very, it's a simple formula. Yep. So that's what it is. And it happens all the time. So it's a big part of due diligence.
Of course it is. And I mean, that's the beauty of commercial property, isn't it? It's numbers based.
That's right.
And there is no escaping it. There's a process that you work through. It's very numbers based. That turns it into what the true value at that point in time actually is, based on an amount of things. Recently, we just saw a property listed that I had someone looking at. Great little property. And again, the agent had asked for the outgoings off the vendor, and the vendor had given it to them. Now, obviously just a small miscommunication. So the vendor, as the agents listed it, they have considered all the outgoings to have been paid by the tenant. So when they gave the net rent, it was vastly different to what was actually happening, because again, the vendor had been self-managing and inadvertently paid most of the outgoings themselves.
Yeah.
So you can only imagine the difference in the net rent was incredible. But in turn, the value difference was incredible as well. And it can be a challenging conversation to have with a vendor, especially if they've self-managed and now their value is less than what they expected, but sometimes less than what they paid for it.
Yeah, and even things like I often find the little bugbear of insurance. Sometimes the vendor will say, well, my insurance bill is $2,500, and you think, wow, this is a pretty big property or something with maybe a $3 million replacement cost, and it's quite often that they're underinsured. And when when I go to get a quote for the insurance, it's not $2,500, it's $12,000.
Yeah.
So there's that balance there where you say to the guy, well, listen, you're so underinsured. Okay, maybe I'm going to wear part of that cost because I'm going to maybe go a little bit. I'd prefer to be over the top with insurance rather than under.
Yeah.
So there's these little sort of things that you find that really can help you renegotiate the price even after you've signed the contract. So when you're in that due diligence period, yeah. So
Absolutely. And the thing is, I mean, again, I get a lot of people say, well, that's a really big drop from what it was advertised at to what it was actually contracted on.
yeah,
That's just incredible, some of the negotiations. And you go, well, it's not really, it's the reality of the value. It's knowing how to do those numbers, how to do the calculations.
that's
And
right.
your cap rate's a big one. But so are your outgoings. Your net rent is another figure that needs to be given some serious consideration.
That's right.
And now it just comes down to what's real at this point in time. So if we can see a massive big drop in value based on, what's happened with a property, you certainly know that you've got leverage with uplifts to increase your value again as you move forward.
That's it. And I mean, just in simple terms, even like the property I've just bought actually with 11 tenants is self-managed, but they did a pretty good job actually. But some of the leases need tidying up, and there was a few things that were sort of badly worded. So even just fixing up all those things,
Yep.
so that if I decided to sell that property in 5 years' time, you could present this perfect deal to someone, with
Yeah, yeah,
perfect list of
absolutely.
outgoings,
Yep.
perfect leases, perfectly maintained property. So naturally, you're going to get, probably a much higher price than if, things are a little bit up in the air. I will say one thing though, Melissa, like when you look at these deals, which can be very cash flow positive, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. I mean, I do see some people that sort of arguing about 20 grand. So, for
Oh,
example, I saw one the other day where it was at least 150,000 a year cash flow positive for this guy, but he was arguing about 20 grand. And I said, well, don't forget, you're going to get that 20 grand back in a matter of
yeah,
months.
yeah.
So don't lose the deal. I mean, there's always give and take in these
Of course
things,
there is.
and if the landlord, the vendor digs in and doesn't want to sell it, for anything less, sometimes you've got to push on with it.
Well, you've got to bring some context to it, don't you?
Yeah, that's
And
right.
you've got to be able to look at that end result and really bring some context back to, okay, so there may be some challenges that have reduced the value, but if that's what they're hell bent on and it's a good deal, there's choices there to be made, isn't there?
Yeah, so I mean, the end goal for most people is, investing. Why are they investing? They really want to replace their income,
Of course they do.
and or just get out, or even replace their partner's income or something. So keep an eye on that goal. That's pretty important.
What banks do you see active in this space at the moment?
Look, I was always someone that used to go direct to the banks, but now, from about 4 years ago, I've just given up on that. It's just incredible the difference using a good
Uh,
broker. So Macquarie Bank, and it seems to go on this sort of rotation. So I'm currently using Macquarie Bank and NAB, but I know that ANZ are active, and then my broker said the other day, oh, ING are very, very
wow.
very, very aggressively lending, but then in 2 months' time that can change. So I
Oh,
think
absolutely.
yeah, so it sort of goes around and around. And
Yep.
I was talking to Macquarie the other day, and they said, "Oh, we've just relaxed all these rules now for commercial.
Oh, wow.
We're back to wanting to do this, and we'll lend 60% on that. Where we're lending 50 before, and
Yeah.
so it's something that's such a minefield. I think
Yep.
it's essential to have a broker.
I agree.
Um, and the
I agree.
classic is having a broker, where I remember speaking to my manager from NAB and said, look, that interest rate you've got me on there is just too high. You need to drop it. And he said, this is the best I can do. And I mentioned to my broker, and she said, let me talk to him. So she spoke to him, and suddenly the rate was dropped, which was it's sort of mad.
It
You think,
is.
why can't I, as the borrower, talk to the bank direct and get a good deal? But no, you've got to go through a broker and they work their magic.
The
So,
thing is, too, if we gave that consideration, I mean, it's probably no different to when we look at self-managing a property. I mean, brokers go into a bank with multiple deals that they're negotiating with a bank,
that's
so
right.
they probably have a little bit better leverage than us at an independent perspective. And for us too, I think if we're dealing with a bank, is there that, okay, we won't push as hard because we know the power that the bank has at times. Whereas a broker, they can be quite ruthless at times. I give them a lot of credit. I couldn't be bothered, to be honest,
Yeah.
going in and out of the banks, trying to work through, like you said, that minefield at the moment of whether they have an appetite for it this week versus
Yeah.
next week,
I
what
mean, look,
is doing the best deals at the moment. There's a lot going on there, and a lot of
yeah,
banks that have not been heard of in the commercial space for a very long time.
yeah, that's it. And I think actually it's important to have a broker that is in the commercial space because,
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard horror stories of, perhaps a more residential focused broker, either being super negative about a commercial deal or just giving people the wrong information. So it's really important. But I know people get tied to their broker, so sometimes they need a second opinion, but you would never want to be in the situation where you had two brokers doing things for you. You sort of got to go with one or the other, I reckon.
Look, I agree. And I think, when you're looking at due diligence, excuse me, we really do need to get back to that on our brokers and our agents and everyone that we're using. If you're in
Yeah,
the commercial space, you want good commercial agents and good commercial brokers working for you, because it is quite a different space to the residential space. And the residential guys do exceptionally well in their space, but it's not
yeah.
often you see them cross over and do the same job, as well as one that focuses wholly and solely on that space in its own right.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, you get these little side benefits too. I mean, my broker, we went with a couple of different banks, and then I got a new Tesla last year, and I said, oh, look, I'm going to lease the Tesla, but I normally just go through X, Y, Z. And she
Yep.
said, oh, hang on a minute, we've just done this deal with Commonwealth. Why don't we, talk to them? And I got a really great deal, super low rate on the lease, so I wouldn't have even thought about that. I could have easily picked up the phone and gone with, another lender, and they would have done the deal, but I'd probably saved 1.5%, on that
Wow.
on that deal.
Yeah,
So it
that's
was
fantastic.
fantastic. Yeah,
They're experts in their own right. It's what they do and it's what they do well, isn't it? And if you've done your
yeah,
due diligence on them and you've got someone that's very active in that space, then yeah, a great recommendation to be using a broker, that's for sure. Just quickly, as far as outgoings that we were discussing before go, for you, what is standard to see a tenant paying as far as outgoings? And then what are those couple of added extras that you see occasionally?
yeah. Look, it is a bit of a minefield because there's you've got all sorts of types of leases, net and gross leases. So you've got a net lease is when the tenant basically pays all the outgoings on top. So they'll pay, let's say, $30,000 a year, and then they'll pay, a proportion of the council rates, water rates, management. Quite often is in there. Land tax is another one. But if
Yeah.
they're on a retail tenancy lease, it can be different, and different states are different. And also, I noticed that in regional areas, in one of my I've got a shopping centre up near Bribie Island, we've got all the tenants except one on gross leases, which means they just pay a fixed monthly rent and I pay the outgoings. It's not my preference, but it's something when you're working the numbers, you have to be really careful that you're working the numbers to see exactly what you're going to end up with
Yeah,
yourself. And
absolutely.
some deals you look at will have, two leases where the tenant's paying some of the outgoings, and another tenant will just be paying a weekly rent that includes the outgoings as well. So you've got to be pretty careful. But generally speaking, council water rates, water usage, waste charges, um, maintenance, gardening, land tax. Land tax is a single holding. Now that can be obviously quite expensive for some landlords if you've got a few properties, but it is based as a single holding value on that property itself. And very important, actually, it's another thing we find when we're doing due diligence on deals is that sometimes in the leases it'll have that the tenant was meant to be paying the outgoings, or all those things I mentioned, but is only paying some of them because someone's forgotten 5 years ago to ask them for it.
Yeah.
And we had that situation recently where a tenant was probably paying 40,000. It was a major childcare tenant, and they were paying about 40,000 less than they should have been. Now, obviously, because we're buying the property now, you're not going to go back and try and get money from them for the last 5 years. But now you've got to bring them up to speed and say, hey, hang on a minute, we're new owners. Now we want according to the lease. You've had it cheap for 5 years. So now you've got to pay the real amount. And so it's very tricky, and you really need a good lawyer and a very eagle eye to go over these things thoroughly.
And I think you need to be a good communicator too, don't you?
Oh, for sure. You really want to be. I mean, look, I believe in creating a win-win situation with a tenant. Now, it doesn't mean that, I mean, COVID's been very interesting, of course, because we've had to, support tenants in a lot of situations. And for us, that's worked out really well. They've all come out of it and gone through it. We all, nearly had heart attacks in March, 2020. We thought it was all going to disappear, but actually everyone wants to keep their business going. So if you can help them, and that sort of brings me back to that positive cash flow. If you're getting positive cash flow from a property and you've been enjoying that positive cash flow for a couple of years, and then a black swan event happens like the pandemic, well, of course you can, you should be able to afford to support those tenants. So probably often a bit of a side tangent there, Melissa, but
It's very relative too, though, because if you're starting off and it's not positive, well, then you're in a world of pain all on your own without consideration for tenants, aren't you? Because now you've still got a loan to pay. The banks aren't going to be that forgiving. And how are you going to deal with that? So you're no longer in a mindset that you can actually see how you're going to support tenants. So it's a very big deal going in, being able to make sure that you're looking at those numbers and understanding what you are ending up with and what that looks like from a positive perspective for you. To be able to support tenants through COVID is an outstanding position to be in to start off with, because we always talk about those give backs into the community and all the rest of it to ensure they can continue in their business, because that allows them to feed their families and all these type of things. A great position to be in, but unless you've done your due diligence well and stack the numbers up well, it's not going to happen.
That's right. And I mean, just to give people a bit of an emotional boost, even by this new centre we're buying now, we're going to launch into a bit of a refurb and pot plants and painting and all that, and social media advertising. So the tenants already, we haven't even settled, they're already getting excited that a new broom sort of sweeping clean. And I mean, you've got to remember too, when you're buying a place, sometimes the tenants are so nervous when a new owner comes in. So you really want to address that quite quickly, and even if it's through, it's all through our property managers, and we don't do it ourselves. So, we get the property manager, go down there, talk to them, say, look, these guys are going to, do this, that, and the other, and they get excited, gives them a bit of a lift. They might even buy more stock for their shop. They start doing more advertising, all that. So, it's just a win-win situation that you want to sort of promote and continue for the future, basically.
Absolutely. I totally agree. It shouldn't be any other way, right? To be in that win-win situation, and you see the good results off the back of it, not just for yourself, but for business and for your tenants. And that's, look, it's a fantastic thing. It really is. Yeah. Any parting words, James? Any great advice that you'd like to pass on to anyone at the moment?
I think actually I was chatting to someone on the weekend, and we are just talking about deals, and we were talking about the residential market and how crazy it is, and they're trying to buy, a young couple trying to buy a house in Ballina actually, and it's really probably around $1 million, and they said, we're so depressed because we could have bought these houses for $500,000, a few years ago. But I said, listen, the repayments are actually about the same, because they were talking 5% a few years ago. So I think it brings out that over my career, nearly 40 years, that there's always deals out there. It doesn't matter, obviously it's a little bit tougher when the market's hot and you've got to make quick decisions, but, exercise that decision making. I said to this young couple, I said, listen, start making some offers. It doesn't cost you anything to make an offer. Yep. But if you're just sort of dicking around the edges all the time, you'll never get in there, and you'll never know what you can actually buy unless you start making an offer. I said, maybe that deal won't come off, but there's always a deal out there. There's always good properties out there, and if you've got the right intention, you'll get a deal. But just, I guess, the last parting words: keep your original goal in mind, particularly if you're an investor looking for cash flow. Don't settle for less than really what you want to get at the end game, because that's what it's all about. Replacing your income so you can go off and do whatever you like, or continue to invest or whatever.
Absolutely. And it's fantastic advice. And I think, like you mentioned earlier in the piece, that just be be conscious of the difference in interest rates that you're paying now to what you were 5 years ago when you were getting a totally different return. If you sit down and do those numbers and look at the net result,
Yeah.
it's not a lot different.
Yeah, that's it, exactly. You just got to put the numbers on a piece of paper and, back of an envelope even. Just once you start working the numbers out, you can do it.
I love the back of the envelope. It's like half a dozen numbers, you're done. Okay. And it doesn't need to be in the first instance. It doesn't need to be more complex than that.
Yeah. Oh no, and look, you'd be the same as some super high net worth individuals, and a couple of my mates that they still do the numbers, on the back of an envelope, or they use their phone. They just, they'll say, oh, this one's getting this, it'll do that, blah blah blah, and you think, but I like to spreadsheet things eventually because that saves you missing out on crucial information because it's all noted down. You don't forget something and leave it out, but if you can get excited about a deal initially by doing quick numbers, that's perfect.
Oh, absolutely. And like you've said before, that you got to you factor in a due diligence period to make sure you've gone through everything finer detail to make sure nothing's missed and it's nice and tidy going in, and your lawyers go over everything and brokers sort it all out for you, and your agents are fantastic. So there's a whole team that you pull into place to do all of this. But in the onset, just being able to get in and do those quick numbers first, and in your mind start realizing what's working and what's not. Yeah. Otherwise you can get very bogged down in a whole lot of spreadsheets before you even know what direction to look in.
Yeah, that's it. Analysis paralysis.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. And it still happens even with rates and stuff the way they are now. Interesting market, though. I've seen a lot of movement in the market, which is super exciting to see. But yes, I get the frustration from some people. Over in WA, they've been very privileged for many years to have the luxury of time on their side to assess things.
Yeah.
Not so much now. So it's exciting what people think.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah. Good words of advice. Keep the end goal in mind. Focus on that. Don't have to settle for anything less, and take the lifestyle that goes with it. It's a choice.
That's it. Exactly.
Thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it. I know you've got number crunching to do. Good luck with the deal. I'm super excited to see how that goes.
Yeah, no, I'll send you some pics when this one, the big one settles, but I'm still doing the numbers on the small one.
Nothing wrong with that. I look forward to seeing them. Certainly look forward to coming up your way when everything settles down a little bit in the coming months.
Fantastic.
Glass of wine on the cards, my friend.
Yeah, perfect.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very, very much, and we'll chat again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.